Do I look okay? I turned my lighting down. Is it better?
You look
Yes.
fucking fantastic, Patrick. If you looked any better,
Awesome.
we'd be in trouble, man.
All right, all right, all right.
I don't know how you do it. It's those freaking jeans.
The old Levi's. Oh, not those kind of
No,
jeans.
it's not the Levi's.
Uh, all right. This is episode 14, right?
I think so.
All right. Welcome back, friends. This is Patrick Miller. I'm one of the hosts of Metal and Forge, a weekly podcast discussing manhood, entrepreneurship, American life, and matters of the soul. If you have not yet visited our website, mettleandforge.com, I invite you to do that and drop some suggestions for future guests and topics that we might discuss. Metal, M-E-T-T-L-E. You know how to spell it by now, mettleandforge.com. We have a special guest with us tonight, and I'm excited to welcome Mary Rosenberger to the podcast. Welcome, Mary.
Thanks for having me. Good to be
Yes. So I've got my co-host, Austin Lapp, is from the same area as Mary. And Austin, you suggested that we have Mary on. Tell us a little bit about that, what initiated that thought in your mind, and tell us why Mary is here tonight, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks again, Mary, for being on. I'm excited for this. I've been looking forward to it ever since I read your book. And that's really what
here.
inspired it. I mean, I heard, working with your husband, Mike, and Russell, and different people from the village over there at Woodtex for a while, just kind of rubbing shoulders with them, hearing bits and pieces of the story, just never really having any single individual put it all together for me. And so when the book came out, I picked it up and, actually we went on a family vacation with my whole family, and it kind of got passed around the whole
Ah.
family.
Fun
And
family reading.
yeah, it was really cool because it brought out a lot of interesting discussions, and it just was kind of this book that was laying around at the cabin, and everyone was kind of vying for it, and you kind of had to fight to get it. And I just liked the discussions that came from it. And the thing that really inspired me the most of the whole thing is that you're someone who has actually done the work. And when I say that, I mean like you've dug deep and you've decided to pursue healing at all costs from all the pain that you and your family and your kids to some degree have been through by being a part of the village. And that's what was most inspiring to me. I mean, anybody can tell a woe was me story, and I didn't get that vibe from the book at all. And I love just the redemptive quality of the book and how you pursue just forgiveness on a deep, deep level and walking out, you know, your pain in just a very raw and authentic way. And I mean, there's a lot of people that I feel get lost right there. Like, and I'm sure there has been people who've been through the village that, you know, we haven't recovered them, so to speak. And that's what was most inspiring to me is someone who grew up as a staff kid in the village and just, the story was fascinating. Of course, I can't begin to understand. I mean, maybe on a small level, but I can't begin to understand everything you went through. So that was the most inspiring. And I figured it'd be really good for our listeners too, because I don't know, we just have this. I love our discussions. They're raw, honest, authentic, and we're always looking to better ourselves and better our listeners. So that was really what inspired it. And I know that Kent, Patrick, and so I just figured we'd have a lively conversation. So that's kind of why I wanted to have you on. And Patrick, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hey, can I jump
Thank
in
you,
on that
Austin.
and just Miller, just by way of a little bit further introduction for those that know nothing of what we're talking about with the village and everything. I actually grew up across the street from Mary, and
Yeah.
I know that she has two siblings. There was three kids in her family, and her parents were, ever since I had known them, her parents were very, very involved with a place called Freedom Village, which was like a mile and a quarter from my house. It was just right down the street. And Freedom Village, Mary, you can probably describe it better, but my understanding is it was this home where kids could come in, troubled kids could come in and hopefully get their lives turned around. And they utilized, I think there was a couple hundred acres. I knew that they had horses involved. Maybe there's like an equine program of some kind, and other means. I believe you guys might have had a football team and a soccer team and some things like that. But it was this home. There was even a farm involved. I don't know if the kids could work there or what, but it was this home for troubled teens primarily, and it might be drug addiction or other things that would bring them in. And then it was explicitly a Christian home, and a lot of salvations happened, and a lot of freedom from addictions did happen. However, the dark side of the story is the leader of the home was abusive, and and I think there was some, even as I think back to back then as a kid, and Mary running around with your brother Jesse, and we had sleepovers, and I was a kid, so you didn't know that much, but I will say, living a mile and a quarter from it, and knowing your family, there was still some, there seemed to be some, a little bit of the, with the leader, a little bit of like the snake oil vibe, just a little bit, like a little bit too smooth for it all to quite make sense. And that was my understanding, and that was about the extent of it at the time. So I just wanted to add that in, since I grew up across the street from her, Patrick.
All right, so let me just see if I can set the table a little bit for those of us who did not grow up around the Finger Lakes region of New York and aren't familiar with that area or familiar with Freedom Village, this community or this organization that Mary's talking about in her book. So Austin and Kent, my co-hosts, are both grew up in the Finger Lakes region of New York, and Mary, you did too, I understand. And my understanding is that Freedom Village, this organization, is right there, like you said, Kent, more or less across the street from where you grew up. So tell us a little bit, Mary, if you would, just kind of lay out the basics in terms of Freedom Village. Approximately when did it start? Who started it? And what was its purpose when it started? And how did you get introduced to it?
Yeah. So it was a Christian home for troubled teenagers, founded by Fletcher Brothers, who was a pastor who had started and grown remarkably quickly a church in Gates, New York.
Now, wait, just to clarify, Fletcher Brothers is one guy. That's a man's name, right?
Yes, and
okay,
I say that all the time. People
sounded a little bit like might be an oil change franchise or something, but you're saying this is the guy's name. Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yes, and actually, it's good that you bring that up, because so many people say, "Wait, he was one guy," and I'm like, "Yes, Fletcher Brothers. His last name Brothers."
Okay, sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
No, it's good. People ask all the time. Right, so he was a pastor and the son of a pastor, and very much Southern Baptist, fire and brimstone, repent or die. And he had a pretty successful church in Gates, which he then began to take money from his congregation to start a radio show called Victory Today, and did not pay them back and got into all kinds of trouble. That church ended up just crumbling, and he moved to Lakemont to do it again, and started a home for troubled teenagers, and just began to go around to different churches, asking for people who wanted to work there. And that's when he met my parents in the early 80s, 1981. And that is right when the ministry was starting. So my parents were some of the first staff people to come aboard for this. He found them in a church in Syracuse, a tiny little church where my parents had recently given their lives to the Lord and pretty much surrendered their whole lives to serving people. And then, of course, not long after that, Fletcher Brothers arrives at their church, poaching for staff people, essentially, and they went. And so that was in 1981. I was not even born yet. So I was born in 87. So by the time I showed up, this was a thriving ministry. Again, it was more like a boarding school, like he said, a huge campus, beautiful facilities right on Seneca Lake, just gorgeous. It looked like heaven, especially for parents, a super vulnerable group of people, parents with troubled teenagers, and you just want your kid to get some help. And I'm sure this sprawling acres on Seneca Lake, kids petting horses and sweeping, and it looked so good. And I think that's where some people did have discernment to go, I'm getting snake oil salesman. Like, I'm not so sure this is what it looks like, but it seems like overwhelmingly most people bought into it and thought, this is incredible. I will follow this guy wherever he goes.
And about how long until maybe Kent or Austin, as outsiders, maybe you have a perspective on this, but when do you think that things kind of started going awry? It sounded like things got off to a good start, and perhaps Mr. Brothers actually had a legitimate experience with the Lord that he was seeking to share with young people. And of course, the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And so, while it would be tempting to classify, good guy, bad guy, and obviously your book details some of the spiritual abuse and those kinds of things, which I haven't had the opportunity to read about yet, but Austin was filling me in. I think we're clear that some negative things happened, but how long until things, until it became more clear to outsiders, at least, that everything was not as it seemed? Does one of you guys have an observation on that?
Yeah, I would say I remember being a kid, and the ministry in my mind was already tainted with somebody who had a silver tongue, who would convince people to give the ministry money, and they would take legitimate experiences that people had in meeting the Lord and becoming free, and found a way to, like, I remember the essence of this when I was in grade school. There was a joke going around. One of my classmates would be like, "Yeah, the pastor said he's so proud of his humility. He's the most humble man out there." Like,
Sounds about right.
So I don't know if it was true or not, but like,
direct quote there.
I don't know if it was what's a direct quote, but I remember already hearing there was already a mar in, or just it was already tainted. It wasn't full blown like mass exodus, people leaving like years later, but I even remember as a kid hearing some of that. Maybe you did too, Ken. I don't know. I remember hearing some of that stuff.
Yeah, I did, but I don't feel like I have a good perspective on when the wheels really started to fall off the bus.
So, Mary, do you have an observation on that? You grew up there, and how long until you knew that something, like, what was your first sign that something was amiss? How old were you?
24. I mean, I never, ever questioned this place, this man, these people, our purpose. Never. I would have followed him to the end. I had it not been so absurd in 2011 when most of the staff ended up leaving. But I mean, that's a good almost 40 years of ministry that he had been doing and had not yet been held accountable for it, because the people that worked with him were so manipulated. And it happens all the time. It seems to be the most pure-hearted people that get taken advantage of. And when your identity becomes ministry, it's really hard to step away from it. And that's what happened. I never thought that anything was wrong with Freedom Village.
So can I ask on that? So Mary, when you were 24 and it was 2011, was that when the majority of the staff left and we wound up working with a number of the staff then? Okay.
Yeah.
So So I guess it would have been about a 30-year run then, the 80s, the 90s, and the first decade of the 2000s. So about a 30-year-ish before it really kind of blew apart there.
Yeah.
And give us some of the highlights of those 30 years. Like what was the looking at it through a charitable lens or through the best light possible, what were the good things that were happening there?
Oh, there was so much good. There was so much good because there were so many people there who wanted to help. And, I grew up in a very musical family. My mom started the music ministry at Freedom Village. She had her hands in all things music, and it grew and grew and grew. But by the time we left, there was 100-voice choir. There was an ensemble that was about half that size of cream of the crop people, but not even like I watched my mom make so much with very little. Like she is a voice teacher, and she will get the best out of the people that she works with. And so, I took for granted hearing these gorgeous voices, harmonies, beautiful, not even realizing like these were troubled teenagers that didn't even know they could sing. And my mom made beauty with all of it. And, there were 3 touring singing groups that toured full time, and I was in one of those. And I spent 11 years from 13 to 24 touring with all of my best friends in a van, just singing, loading up sound equipment, going to schools and detention centers. And, there's a dark side when you look back and go, oh, wow, I was kind of used for money. We were put out there, and in our minds, we were reaching the lost. But in reality, we were raising money everywhere we went. And so it's a very complex place to process.
Yeah, that sounds like it.
So much good, so many friends, lasting relationships, just beautiful things that I can't say didn't happen. And so that's what I'm grateful for, is that there really was a season when my eyes were opened to the abuse that happened, which was years after even leaving. I didn't even know when we left. Like it took so long for that to catch up to me. And when I realized that it was so abusive, I really wanted to just say, this is all bad. This was all bad. Dumpster fire, burn it all down, but the Lord would just keep reminding me there's diamonds in there. You can't, I'll go in there with you. I will essentially descend back into hell with you, and I'll show it to you through my eyes. And that's when I could see the beauty and the horror, like at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's a gift, but it was a process for sure.
Miller, if I could say 2 more things about good, the one thing that I would say is the program, it did work to the extent that let's say the best example might be for addictions. My understanding is the program actually worked exceptionally well for breaking addictions. And Mary, you know this way better than I. So I might be, my opinion on this might be too anecdotal. I just know one guy who at one point was outside of a gas station in his car in Philly or somewhere in Pennsylvania with a needle in his arm and almost died multiple times. And now he was able to break that addiction at the Village, and now he's just one of the best guys you're ever going to meet. So it seemed to work at least well enough that, I would say like it worked at the mean or it worked at the average, but I'm curious to know what if you disagree, I'm all ears. But the other thing that I would say, Miller, is that, and I don't know, again, if I just haven't met enough of the people there, but the people that I've met that had come out of there, we all know a number of them, including you, Mary, and they turned out to be exceptionally strong people. Yes. So, whether that was because of it or in spite of it, I'm not sure. But those are the 2 things that I would add, Miller, is it did seem to work and it did create strong people.
The first point you made was actually the clarifying question I wanted to ask, because I'm interested in human transformation. I'm interested in what initiates and sustains real transformation, especially in the area of addiction. And I have talked to some people who came through Freedom Village and former heroin addicts. And I mean, the amount of people who are heroin addicts who come out of that and put their lives back together, like that number rounds down to zero. And
Yeah.
so to talk to more than one, like
Yeah.
that just doesn't happen really, you know? And so on one hand, you might just chalk that up to the miraculous work of the Lord. But I have to, as someone who's currently in doing work with men in breaking addiction, breaking strongholds in the areas of pornography and other destructive things, I'm really interested in what exactly was going on there that produced that kind of transformation across a number of different people's lives that appears to have been sustained now for, you know, more than a decade.
Mm. Yeah. The reason I kind of went is because I've actually had a lot of conversations with people who have reached out and said, you know, I really don't agree that you're going to say that Freedom Village was a, you know, an overall bad place. Like, you're calling it a cult. Like, that's pretty strong. You know, people that are saying I was there in the early 90s, in the mid, and it's what I needed. I needed something that was going to get me out of where I was, to get me clean, and Freedom Village did that for me. And I don't disagree. I just know how much we were trained, and at least I was trained because I was on the road all the time doing presentations. All of the emphasis was on the greatness of Freedom Village, that it was this ordained piece of land by God himself, that he had purposed this, that this was the promised land for troubled people. And the amount of people that were giving glory to Freedom Village, and what that really means is pastor brothers. It was not God. And yes, people did meet God there. And I believe that's because God was there. Not because it was ordained, but by default, because God is everywhere. So to say I met God at Freedom Village is like, well, yes, and I met him at the gas station down the road. Like, there's nothing special about this place in that sense. I do believe that if Freedom Village had never existed, that God would have pursued these people some other way. But I think it helped people get clean. It's important. But I cannot find a lot of people, hardly any, who would say that they came out spiritually better on the other side. I think there was a lot of behavior modification going on. And that's something that has really kind of grown in my mind as I've talked to locals here, is that they'll say, almost without fail, we all knew something was wrong with that place. They all say it. We all knew something just seemed off. And especially it was when Fletcher Brothers would be around. People would get the ick from him, as locals especially. But then they would say, but then we saw you guys singing at Starshine and Penn Yan, or we saw you riding on a parade, you know, flatbed truck singing I Love America. And it just looked so good. So how can you deny all these teenagers that were just, you know, a needle hanging out of their arm 2 months ago, and now they're in ironed khakis, collared shirts, smiling, you know, saying that they've been transformed. And like you said, Patrick, like I'm interested in spiritual change, like darkness to light. And I'm learning that that's not a 2-week process. Like, that's damaging to sell that to parents. And that's what we were doing. We were going on the road saying, just 3 months ago, this kid was neglected, had never brushed their teeth, and was doing drugs, and now look at him. So if you'd like to be a part of more of that, give us money. And it's like, so the amount
Yeah.
of
I'm starting
behavior.
to see. I'm starting to see the kind of ick that you're describing there. That does feel kind of icky. But
Yeah.
I want to double click on that kind of quick transformation that you mentioned. There's a couple kind of frameworks that seem self-evident as frameworks that you might use to produce that kind of transformation. How do you take somebody with a needle in their arm and then you put them on the road in a khaki pants and an iron shirt 3 weeks later, and they're singing in part of the choir. So one framework that comes to mind is a kind of disciplinarian or militaristic kind of discipline, kind of boot camp type of environment that might do that. Using fear, shame, guilt, manipulation might do that. But there's that's only two of maybe a number of different potentials. I'm curious, what do you think was actually going on? What was the program that produced, at least, I'm not suggesting that it produced any lasting spiritual transformation necessarily, but whatever transformation that you did see when you went, from the needle in the arm to the khaki pants in, a couple of weeks, like, what was that, like a really well run, well disciplined and thorough program and set of motivations, set of kind of guidelines about behavior modification, and then very strict consequences for what happened, what happened if you didn't obey? What was the culture like there?
It was fear of punishment, at least for me. And I am an open book, and literally, I'm open to answering questions. But at the end of the day, I know my story. It does appear that I was a very concentrated amount of this, and that everyone else seemed to be suffering from the same. So I can't say for everybody else, but for me, and I can't attribute this to anything but Freedom Village, because I had never known anything, but I didn't have any before Freedom Village. It just, I was there. And the fear of punishment motivated all of my decisions.
Can you tell us about the wood carrying thing briefly,
Yeah.
just to give Patrick kind of an idea?
Yeah, I'm curious
Right.
about what kinds of punishment
Right.
were being
Listen to
meted at.
this.
Yeah, so there were many punishments within the program of Freedom Village, and so one of those punishments for the program, it started out just being program rules. So this is for the troubled teens. You come in, there's a level system immediately. As soon as you're in, you're on what was called C level, and that was sort of this neutral level. If you disobeyed, didn't listen, cursed, and there were a list of rules. If you break them, your level drops. And if it drops, then you have less of a life. You can't talk to people. You have to sit alone at a lunch table. You just do chores all day, go to school, chores, go to bed. If it dropped all the way down to what was called no level, you had no life. And this, again, it began as only for the program kids. So they couldn't talk to anybody. They would go to the wood pile. So there was 2 wood piles on the campus. On the south side was for the boys. On the north side was for the girls. And it was literally a pile of wood. It was logs, decent sized logs, and you would pick them up and carry them in the circle, drop the log, walk without the log, pick the log back up, carry it in a circle for hours. And they were monitored by other program kids, which then introduced this sort of mutiny of, why am I being monitored by my peers?
Mm-hmm.
So everything just made everybody paranoid. So much public shame. It's insane. They would haul wood from 5 to 6 in the morning before chores, and then they would go back out every night from 6 to 8. And you could get 3 days of that punishment or 15 weeks. I saw people get 20 weeks of that for whatever. depends what you did wrong. If you passed a note to a boy, 15 weeks of no level, this is your life for the next 15 weeks. So if you had any smartness about you there, you did what you're told. You follow the rules. And that was me. I wanted to be good. I wanted to be a good kid. And so the strange thing that started happening by the time I became a teenager was that all of the rules for the program kids began bleeding into the staff kids' lives. And Pastor Brothers was not satisfied with having control over the program. He wanted it in the staff families. So he would discipline staff kids with the woodpile with no consent from their parents whatsoever. And
oh, snap.
Oh yeah, no, there was nothing they could do. And if you were to say anything against the pastor, you were fired.
And so if you didn't like that the pastor was sending your kid, so you worked there, you earned your living there, and if the pastor punished your kid and you complained, you could lose your job. Like that.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, that's rough.
And I mean, this sounds like this man was a raging maniac, and what the heck were we all thinking? But it wasn't. It looked just like my church now. Like it looked just like he used so much scripture to support his rules, his punishments. Everything was backed up with scripture, King James Version. Like,
yeah, I'm sure.
Everything. He would preach, honor your mother and father in the Lord. That means me, he would say. Everyone has their parents, but then you have your parents in the Lord. And of course, this made so much sense to these kids who had horrible parents, or maybe no parents, or abusive parents. And he's saying, I know you can't trust your parents. You trust me because I'm your spiritual authority. So This verse means your pastor is your parent in the Lord. So you obey me and things will go well. And I believed it. I believed all of it.
Yeah. It's fascinating because I've been thinking about this idea that I was talking to a guy who grew up Schwarzentroober Amish. I don't know, Kent or Austin, if you guys know what Schwarzentroober Amish are. Maybe Mary, you've heard of this, but there's groups of Amish that are more conservative than the old order. They're the most conservative Amish groups, basically.
Yeah.
And there's a friend of mine who grew up in that context, and we were talking, and he was telling me a little bit about his childhood, and he's very open about sharing these stories. I'm sure I don't think he would mind me sharing this, but he said basically his first memory is of being 5 years old is like what he first remembers about being a human being is being raped at 5 years old by an older cousin. So he had tons of trauma and just a very challenging environment to grow up in, but it was a mixed bag. There was also some good things going on there, but it was a really, he wasn't protected. But he said, I still, when I look at, he now is married and has children. And he said, when I look at my kids' peers in school, in public school and around them, and I look at the lives in the wider community around me, yes, there was consequences to having too much order, and I grew up with those consequences. But I would choose that over the consequences of having not enough order. And we were talking about why that might be. And the one thing that I was thinking about is that, in a marriage where you have, in an ideal kind of marriage, you have a kind of push-pull dance between the husband and the wife where the wife might push up against the husband in just the places that he needs to be pushed up against in order to maximally develop and grow into the individual that God created him to be. And I think that a good parent serves the same function in a kid's life, is he pushes against the kid and provides some structure for the kid to kind of grow up against. And when that is just leveled, when there's just no order whatsoever, it's just pure chaos. And I think we can all look at families today where that's the the order of the day. It's just pure chaos. There's no structure. There's no order. There's no schedule. They never eat dinner together. There's no expectations of a certain kind of behavior that's required. It's just pure chaos. And those kids actually don't really become like, they're just kind of blobs, psychologically speaking. And my theory is that you need something to rub up against to shape you. You need something to come against you in some way, almost a beneficial adversary, if you will.
Yeah.
And I've heard Dr. Jordan Peterson talk about this idea too, and he puts forward the idea as well that the consequences of too much order can be brutal. I mean, the stories you talked about, Mary, reminded me of some of the work camps in Hitler's concentration camps, and the sign above the door read that Arbeit macht frei, which is, work will free you, essentially, and just pointless labor. And so, that the consequences of too much order can be brutal, but on balance may not be as devastating to the human psyche as no order at all. And it sounds like some of the kids that were coming into the program might have come from just pure chaos. And when they came out of pure chaos into something that had a lot of order, a lot of structure, and probably way too much, they at least benefited from kind of having something to rub up against and something to kind of bring them forward out of the field of potential that was this kid. Thoughts on that? Anybody?
Well, I totally agree with the premise, Patrick, because I think it's a lot like water in a bucket or just water dumped out, and so I think that's what you're talking about with the structure. The thing that stands out to me earlier is you were talking about like the different types of strategies to get outcomes that you want. This goes back a little bit to what you were talking about, Patrick. Is it fear of discipline? Is it using shame and fear? Is it what are there are a few different ways to go about getting outcomes to this. It stands out to me that there's at least two at the Village, which was, one, fear of punishment. That seems to be a pretty significant one. And then the other is social influence, the influence from your peers. And, you would know this, Mary, but, if one of your fellow classmates, so to speak, program kids is out making sure you walk around that circle with the wood, or my understanding is there was also this thing where if you saw someone do something bad, you were to go tattle on them and then bring them into line. It does seem like very much there was this culture of using everyone against everyone to get the outcomes and behaviors that they wanted. And, that's also pretty sinister, but it can also be pretty effective.
Mm-hmm.
It is both. Yeah, it is both. And I think the duality of Freedom Village is diving deeper into that for me is, I think, what saved me from losing my mind, because I almost lost my mind thinking about all of this before writing this book and putting it together. It was just so complex, and anytime I would swing to one side of the pendulum, there would be all these people, if I would get into a little too deep to, oh, this was spiritual abuse, it was, how dare you, that place, God changed my life through that. And then I would go, okay, I'll be open-minded to that. And then I would go over and I would say, oh my goodness, the beauty that was at Freedom Village. And then everybody over here would go, how dare you, that place ruined me. And, so it was quite the ride of, oh my goodness. And I think it was just a huge display of good and evil, of light and dark, and the good that was there of, hey, God was essentially doing this thing that he's been doing since the beginning of time for people, of pulling them out of the miry clay, out of the chaos of a lawless childhood, and setting them on a firm foundation of it, at least you're clean. At least you're not in that anymore. And that was so God. And then there was the dark of, legalistic teachings that really got inside people's heads and messed them up. And what I'm saying is, at least from my perspective, most people from Freedom Village, especially the people whose lives are put together and they are recovering, and perhaps they're still sober to this day, they never looked back. Those are the people that are most like me, who are saying, I don't want to go back and revisit any of that. It helped. Like, leave it alone. Let's stop talking about this now. And that's before we got on here. Austin asked, what's it like right now? Like, what are the sales like? How does it all kind of fall? And it's ironic because I wrote the book for people who were at Freedom Village, because my life-changing encounter with Christ at the age of 31 years of being a Christian, and then I meet Christ, only came as a result of being willing to look at this thing that I wanted to just move on. I just wanted to move on. And so the people who were at Freedom Village are actually appearing to be the group of people that are taking the longest to buy the book. And
fascinating.
Right. Most sales are local people, or people that have gotten to know me in the last 14 years, which I think is funny. This is the 14th episode. We've been gone from Freedom Village for 14 years. So that's fun. But it's the people that I've heard from that have bought the book who were from Freedom Village are mostly saying it's sitting there and I can't read it yet, or I'm doing this very slowly because it's bringing me back and I don't want to go back. And so that's tricky, it's putting off the possibility that maybe there's something very wrong we all believed about God there. We met him, God was there, of course, but there was not a healthy perspective on the fatherhood of God, the heart of God, the compassionate Jesus. There was no talk of the Holy Spirit. It was a completely disordered view of who God was. And you can limp along in your life for a really long time with a disordered view of who God is. And your life can work for a while. But for me, it was manifesting at the age of 31 in completely debilitating, horrific anxiety. I could not get through the day almost without just horrible thoughts of I'm messing up everything. Everybody's mad at me. I can't do anything right. I'm ruining my children. I'm a terrible wife. And these were the thoughts that ruled my life. And never would I have thought it had anything to do with Freedom Village. Never. I just thought, this is my sin and I can't seem to figure it out.
So it's interesting that you didn't really have a before Freedom Village to compare to. You were born there and grew up there for the first 24 years of your life, and then you were out of there. You kind of lurched out of there along with a bunch of other people in the kind of 2011 timeframe, and then approximately 6 years later, you've alluded to you had this encounter with Christ. Would you just share with us a little bit about your journey to Christ and how you your experience today of walking with Christ, and how did that all come about?
Yeah, well, plot twist, Patrick was totally involved. I always say, and I've told so many people about you, that you tipped the first domino of, whoa, my worldview is all changing. Like, it kind of pulled the rug.
You know, it's funny because when you messaged me to ask if you could quote me in the book, I don't think I realized how that I had played that role, and it was a kind of offhanded conversation in a pool hall in
Yeah.
somewhere in the Finger Lakes region after a holiday party, you know, and I was talking to you and your husband. I worked with your husband at the time, and I remember that we had that conversation, but I don't think I had any idea that it was kind of a pivotal conversation for you. But take us from that and kind of what was the kind of unfolding for you that kind of
Yeah, I mean,
what
I encountered you that night with all of that anxiety, carrying it with me. But of course, performing very well. I mean, that's the other thing is I've been a lifelong performer. I've been on stage forever, whether it's singing or classical ballet, performances galore. And so I wouldn't have thought that anything was necessarily wrong with me. And so it wasn't even like the ultimate performer, meaning I'm convincing myself I'm fine. Like that's a whole other level of delusion. But yeah, that was at the end of 2017, I believe. Does that sound right? I think that's
yeah.
December 2017. And yep, we decided to go to a pool hall for drinks after a dry holiday party. And so we went to the bar and it was the most offhanded. I wasn't seeking you out. Like we were literally waiting to play pool, I think. And you had a recent spiritual transformation. So
Yes.
I think you were just telling everybody that you met that you had been delivered from fear. And you were telling me, and somehow we got into that. And I remember telling you, I'm so anxious. Like, I don't even know what to make of your story because I'm anxious all the time. And I remember you tearing up and actually getting emotional in the pool hall. And you said, there's a song that I've been listening to by Audrey Assad, and the lyric was, "Out past the fear, doubt becomes wonder."
I
And
could get kind of emotional just thinking about
I,
that song. That song played a really pivotal role for
yeah,
me.
yeah, and I knew that you were telling the truth. That was something I didn't realize how well at the time. I had no idea how much I had been lied to, and I've trusted a liar my entire life. But I knew you were telling the truth. But I was also so intrigued. What does that even mean? There's something that's past fear. Like I've never not lived in fear. And so I went home from that. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I messaged you on Facebook and just was kind of like, I'm sorry if this is weird, but like you started something in my head. What are you talking about? How are you not scared? How can you go to a bar as a Christian and not be worried about people seeing you? Or how are you not worried that you're sinning? Like, I just couldn't get over that. What if you're sinning right now? Do you not even care? How do you sleep at night? Oh my God. And you did what Jesus would do, which was, I think my message too was like this long, like it was so unhinged. And you answered back like, what do you mean by afraid of sinning or something? Like you were genuinely like, what do you mean? What are you afraid of, Mary? And that was the question that really tipped the first domino. What are you scared of? What are you actually afraid of? And I was like, I don't think I know. I actually don't know what I'm afraid of. And then it was, punishment, condemnation, separation from God, consequences of my unintended sin. So many Bible stories that had been taught to me with a fear lens of like, you could think you're doing it all right. And then Jesus will tell you, get away from me. I never knew you. Like all of these Bible stories that I was taught as a child who was way too young to begin to understand these deep metaphors that Jesus was talking about, all of it. I was terrified of all of it. And that's when I decided I had somewhat of a nervous breakdown shortly after that. Actually, I was borderline abusive to my kids. I was verbally out of control. I would lose my shit all the time. I was rageful, and it was my own frustration with myself. But as anyone who has children knows, you can't control them. And I had been able to control everything in my life up until then. Mike, not so much. So it's like husband, whoa, this is that. But with kids, and we had 3 kids in 3.5 years. So they were all little, and I was out of control, and I just couldn't do it anymore. And I remember having a really bad moment of just, I don't want to be here. Like, I wish I was a rock. I wish I was something that didn't have to think about all of this all the time. And I was at the end of myself. And so I had somewhat of an epiphany then, that it was sort of a voice or an understanding that everything I know about God has been taught to me by someone. And I just kind of had a sense that something's not right with that. Maybe not. Maybe it's all true. But it was sort of like, question that. Like, question, why are you afraid of God? Go there. And that's when I started to get this feeling that I might be wrong about God. And I sort of have this little theory of like, God will save you. Oftentimes he'll speak your worst fear to you with love and compassion and mercy. And so I think my whole life I was just like, I can't be wrong. I can't be wrong. I can't, if there's such a cost, I'll go to hell. All my friends will go to hell if I'm wrong, and my kids won't get saved. And oh my God. And it was just like, God was like, you're wrong. And I was like, oh God. Like, but then there was sort of this good news about it. Like, and that's good news. So I just went on this journey of like, maybe God is better. Maybe I've been wrong about him. But I was so scared to do anything. So in 2018, I put away all of my devotionals. I had so many. I would read all kinds of devotionals and journal and, self-help galore. But I put it all away, and I said, I'm going to learn about Jesus from Jesus. I'm going to read the Gospels. That's it. I'm not going to listen to anybody. I'm not going to go to anybody for counseling. I'm not going to go to therapy. And that's good for some people, but I think God knew for me, I could not have a person of authority telling me what to do, because I would just do it. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. And it was just, I had this urge to read about Jesus in this new place of maybe I've been wrong about God. And I did, and it took me about 6 months to get through the Gospels, and I started to get some traction under my feet. And at the same time, I felt the urge to write about my life. And it was like, not to be gross, I mean, it was like a diarrhea. Like, it was like, this is more than an urge. This is happening. Like, this is going to happen. And I started to just write from the beginning. I started a blog called Out from the Inside. And I just started at the beginning. I had no plan. I had no outline. I had no training. I just wrote, and I would sit and write for 6, 7, 8 hours at a time in like a trance almost, come out of it. I didn't even proof. I didn't even edit. I just published it. And people started reading it, and people were curious, obviously. And I did that for a year, and I wrote 13 chapters over the course of 2018, and I discovered my life at the same time as everybody else. It was completely cathartic, everything. And when I got to the end of 2018, finishing up to where I was then, I just knew, oh my gosh, God is Pastor Brothers. They're the same thing. And that was where I went, if that is the one true God, and he's like that, I'm not following. I'm out. That's not, but I knew there was something else. So then came 2019, which held massive faith deconstruction, just burn it all down, just to nothing. Because I just knew that because I was in Freedom Village since birth, I had been under that man's teaching and preaching since forever. it was just like poison was in there from the very beginning. And yeah, I proceeded to dismantle everything, question all of it, with the hope that God was like Jesus. And turns out he is. As Brian Zond would say, God has always been like Jesus. Jesus
Turns out,
is what God has
turns
to
out
say.
he is.
Yep. And I
Yeah.
mean, Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God was a massive part of that faith deconstruction time. C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, it was incredible. But what was really interesting was that the Lord was so present. Not that he's not always, but the awareness of the presence of God was insane. And I was having revelation while I was working at Oak Hill Cafe. You know, I would literally be like chopping potatoes, have a revelation about my identity, and like run to the break room and write it down on a napkin. Like that's this level of, oh my gosh, I am who God says I am. But then I would read these books by Tozer and C.S. Lewis and Brian Zahnd, and I would read their revelations that I had already had alone with the Lord.
Yeah.
It was like, yes, God used people to come alongside me and affirm this, so I'm not just going off the deep end and, you know, the Spirit, and I'm gone. But what was so cool was that these people didn't know they were doing it for me, and it was always affirming what the Lord told me rather than somebody told me this and I'm going to pray about it. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. And it's funny because our lives are very, very different, you know, but our journey with Christ and our journey from taking apart the false religion that we lived in and finding the God that is Christ, the God that we can see the fullness of God in the person of Christ, and encountering his love. It's so fascinating how our journeys kind of mirror each other in that way. And we met, you know, right at a time when the novelist Ted Dekker had just kind of served as the kind of, you know, knocking down the first. He was one of the first ones to knock the domino down for me. But others, Jamie George and Paul Farmer, were several mentors in my life who were really instrumental in pushing that domino over. But that encounter of revelation that you then see in other people's writings, people like C.S. Lewis. And just today I was reading, my lovely wife, MJ, brought me a book. It was around lunchtime. She was reading short stories. I forget. It was Dostoevsky's short stories, a collection of short stories by Dostoevsky. And I think the last story in the book is, I forget the name of the little essay, but it's something like The Prayer of a Madman or something like that. Mm-hmm. She said, you have to read this. And I stopped what I was doing. When she says that, I listen. And I stopped what I was doing and I read that. And we just sat there and wept. It was just so gripping and so beautiful. And it was like this, it was so deeply true, and it so resonated what he was saying because it had already been revealed in my heart as being true. And it was like, there's just something deeply, that the resonance that you feel when you read another saint's work that just resonates with the work that Christ has already revealed to you through the Spirit. It's one of the most encouraging and it's such a beautiful experience. I'm so happy that you got to experience that. Yeah. Fantastic. So that has been, thank you for sharing that testimony. Kent and Austin, thoughts or questions for Mary regarding all this?
Yeah, one of the things that stands out to me is, all it can take sometimes is a very small seed. You think, what could a 15 or 30 minute conversation in a pool hall, what could really be like the outcome of that? Like, how much good could you really get out of that? And it just doesn't seem like that's how it works. It seems like a small seed sometimes, like a word fitly spoken, sometimes is all it takes to start a path into a whole other life, essentially.
Yeah. And
right.
the funniest thing is that in stories like this, at least, growing up in such an evangelical culture of agenda-driven conversions, go plant the seeds. Like, we're literally going to go door to door handing out tracts, believing that we're planting seeds, and possibly, but the seeds, most sowers it's completely unknowing. We don't know what we're doing when we're being used by the Holy Spirit. And if you think you are, then that's kind of I'm proud that I'm so humble. It's I don't know about that. I really think the Holy Spirit moves through people when they are so completely unaware. And that's Patrick barely remembers that. And that was such a moment of my life. And that's why Oswald Chambers, I love his writing. It's not his, My Utmost for His Highest is a compilation of sermons from his wife, putting them together. But he has one on the Great Commission, and he just says that word go and make disciples. That is translated to live. Just live the life that God has given you, and you will make disciples. It's less of a command and more of a promise. This is what's gonna happen. And yet,
Wow,
of course,
I love that.
we have something to do, because we want to be important, and we want to have purpose. And little do we know, it's baked right into our ordinary lives, the purpose of making disciples. And I've never had so many meaningful, for someone like me who has spent 11 years praying with people at altars for salvation, kids in Christian schools, people in detention centers. I've been there. I've led hundreds of people to the Lord. And it wasn't until recently that I started to talk to people for real and actually just get into relationship with people. And the amount of people that are attracted to the light that is in me, their conversions are oh my goodness, this is long term. This is a friendship that's the basis of this. And I don't have an agenda to fix anybody. And it's really made me realize how not connected I've been with humanity my whole life. Because when you're a missionary kid, that's who I identify the most with. It's less than church kids or pastors' kids. It's I was a missionary kid, basically. So you just see the world around you as the mission fields. And that's unhealthy to a large degree, especially for children, because it just takes away the humanity of that person. And there was something that the program kids said to me all of my teenage life, and it was always, you think you're better than us, don't you? You think you're better. You act like you're better. You have your perfect life, and we all wish we were you. So it was this weird thing of well, do you wish you were me, or do you hate me? I don't understand. But I actually did think I was better than them, in the sense that I'm saved, you're not. Let's make this happen. So pray with me so that I then know that your security is forever. But then I don't care if you're thirsty or hungry or need anything. I'm moving on to the next person that hasn't prayed the prayer yet. That was my mindset. No wonder I didn't connect with anyone genuinely. And it's taken a while to figure out what that is. How do I not have an agenda to change people all the time?
Yeah.
And it truly has knowing Christ. Imagine.
I have to jump in on that, Mary, because what you said about discipleship, essentially discipling people, meaning go and live your life. It was this past summer at some point, and we were on a walk on a Saturday afternoon, my wife and I forget what area of life it was that we were talking about, but back to Miller over here changing the world. We were on this walk in our neighborhood, and Patrick, I don't think I told you this, but my wife and I were walking, and we were talking about a certain aspect of life and how we wanted to be more like the Millers in this one aspect of life. And we were talking about this, and it was one of those sort of kind of revelatory, like you kind of see how it could be, like you see the truth in it and you're drawn to it and you want more of that in that area in your life. And it's really helpful when you see it modeled for you in someone else. And so we were just talking about this, and then it just kind of occurred to one of us like, oh, wow, what if that's what discipleship actually is? What if that's what discipling people actually is? Living your life in such a way that other people want to or can follow it. And by doing so, they get more of the good and less of the bad. And what if it's actually that, living your life, as opposed to once a week at 7 p.m. with a discipleship group? And that felt true to me when we struck upon that. I did not look it up, but from that moment on, I was convinced that is the best form of discipling. That's the best form of discipleship. And, I do feel like that is an underreported aspect of the Christian life because, I'm not totally sure I've ever heard that coming across the pulpit or taught in a church setting, to be quite frank about it. And maybe it was implicitly and I didn't pick up on it. But it does seem like if it is something that is believed to be true among most evangelical churches, they are not talking about it explicitly. What is talked about explicitly is discipleship groups, Bible studies, small groups, and those may happen to be fine for some people also. But it just occurred to us that we might be settling for less than the best. It's actually hard to do better than someone living their life in such a way that you want to follow them in that area of their life, be more like them in that area of life. And so I just wanted to, you just, sealed the deal on that thought process for me, Mary, that, if Oswald Chambers says it must be true, then it must be, right? So, but it makes sense. And so,
it does make sense.
Credit to you on Miller for that one too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's humbling to hear that. Thank you.
Mary, what would be your best guess on how many kids total have gone through that program? And then how many of them, or what percentage of them, had or experienced an outcome as well as yours?
Great question.
You mean with a genuine spiritual encountered transformation of faith?
Yep. And seeing maybe what was there, the real of what was there, the good and the bad, and then processing that and moving on. But most importantly, I guess, moving past the idea of, or moving past some of the things or the worldviews or the thought process that was so ingrained in them there, and moving on with a life of freedom.
It's hard to, I don't want to throw out some absurd statistic, mostly because Pastor Brothers used to do that all the time. I'm like, do you know 716,000 children have come through this program? And we'd be like, oh, but there were these ridiculous things. I would say thousands for sure, possibly into the tens of thousands. I don't know. But a lot. I would say thousands, conservatively. The reach out, the ripple effect, because we were on the road and we were preaching and teaching his gospel. So by default, those people that we sort of filtered into were also affected by the teachings of Freedom Village in some way. But what I'm finding is that it's so often that the Lord will take you back through where you've been to lead you where you're going. And I think that's why it took 5 years between the blog and the book being published. That was me, doing the Great Commission, living my life and just talking about this and having honestly so much pushback from people who were saying, you're just bitter. Why would you do this? Why would you talk badly about a Christian place? And I started to realize that like a lot of people seem to not be processing through their experience at Freedom Village. And as I was blogging, the thing that I was told the most in private messages from people that reached out was two things. One, I just wanted to never think about Freedom Village again. Like, I wanted to just put it behind me and not think about it. Two, I thought I was crazy. So it's like, those two things are so sad to have together, because the crazy thing, the gaslighting, the manipulation, it prevents you from going back to deal with it, because then you think there's nothing wrong with you, but you're also miserable. So I must just be crazy is what most people have landed at. And so I don't think very many people at all that have been through Freedom Village have processed it from the lens of, was I spiritually abused? Was I mentally manipulated, specifically in a spiritual sense? Because it's A.W. Tozer says that, like, the most important thing about a man is what he thinks of God. And if that is the case, then the people who were in the teaching at Freedom Village do not have a good view of God. And most of them, even in my family, like, it's been wild to process this through this with them, is that I can talk to people, and just the way they talk about themselves, I can tell that the voice in their head is Fletcher Brothers, but they believe it's God's. And that's so damaging, to have a constant condemning voice in your head and believe that it's the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Wow. That's well said.
That's not just ex-villagers. That's the church. I mean, that's where my story takes a turn from like weird cult into like, no, this isn't everywhere. This is a lot of places where people believe that the sick feeling in their stomach and their feeling of never being able to measure up is Holy Spirit conviction. And that's
wow. Yeah, that's great insight. And I'm glad you said that, because that is very common outside of just the cult background.
Right. And it's almost impossible to see it. It's almost impossible for people to be able to see it happening to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because what if you're wrong?
It's so difficult to your point. It's really difficult to turn around and face the reality of what you've experienced and to unpack it. After I was set free from addiction, more than 30 years addicted to pornography and other things, when I was set free by the love of God, I encountered the love of God through the person of Christ, and I was set free. I was liberated. Like John 8 says, I encountered reality in a way that liberated me. And
love that.
My initial reaction, thinking back to my years in a very fundamentalist Beachy Amish community, was I was angry that I'd been sold a false bill of goods. And I'm glad that you have navigated this and pointed out the duality of it, where there is some good and there is some bad. There's some truth and there's some lies. There's some profoundly healing and beautiful aspects of it, and then there's some aspects of it that are really destructive and hellish, frankly. Because that, I think we have to, if we're going to go back and get on solid footing, you have to confront both sides of that. You have to be willing to descend into the depths of hell, but you have to speak the truth about what you see. And there's a verse in James 1, I think it's verse 21, that came to mind as you were talking about your kind of the way in which you just wrote. You just wrote and wrote and wrote. But this word just came out of you, and it just, you just committed it to the internet. But the second part of that verse says that you should surrender, something like you should surrender to the logos, to the word that has been planted in you, for it has the power to save your soul. And that logos is the same logos that is in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and without him was not anything made that was made. And that logos that is implanted in you, that eternal Spirit of Christ in you, is what helps you map yourself onto reality in a way that is redemptive and is salvific and liberating ultimately. And that's the liberation that he's talking about in John 8:31 and 32. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And that idea of mapping our lives onto the reality of a resurrected Christ is like, if God's love is the basis of reality, if the I am says I am love, then that is what's most real. And if we truly seek to map our lives onto that as a reality, like from the start, from scratch, to reshape our entire perceptions and our attentional hierarchy and everything on that reality, and then let whatever comes from that. It's a tremendous act of faith to take that step and to go, yes, I'm going to live as if that were true. And to map your life onto the reality of a resurrected Christ, and that trusting that you can see the fullness of God through the lens of Jesus, Yeshua the Christ, the person who walked in the near Middle East 2,000 years ago, that you can see the fullness of God's character in that, and that life, death, and resurrection gives you a pattern for your life and a Lord to worship and a belief, and something that it's reality, something you can ground your life into, and you can ground the very core of your identity onto, and everything can unfold from that. And when you start to live that way, it's like you have to depend upon the logos, that word that streams from you, and to the extent that you learn to live by that. I love how Jesus said that he only said what he heard the Father teach him to say, and I think he meant that as an example for us. And that word that flows from us, that it's like when we're fearful and we start to mediate that word with our conscious fear, and we's like, well, no, I can't say that, or I might offend that person. It's like, now we've corrupted the message. But if we truly learn to trust him and lean into that, that's when we start to see the life of the kingdom of heaven manifest itself in our heart, in our home, in our marriage, and in our communities. And so it's been so wonderful to hear you describe that, and I'm so glad that you got to use your words to find your way out of that chaos that you were in, and to put waste to the monsters of chaos that fundamentally threaten you, and threaten to destroy nearly everything about you. And you have seen God's love heal you and your family, and that you're on solid footing. And you've written a book about it. Let's plug the book a little bit. Tell us about the book, and about when did you write it, and where can people buy it, and what's the title of it, and what do you hope comes of it?
Yeah. So I decided to just go balls to the wall and call the book Freedom Village, because I was just like, well, what do I call it? Freedom from fear, like whatever. And I was like, no, if this is me going, hey, Freedom Village people, this is a book for you, I'm gonna just call it Freedom Village, so there's no weeds to get caught up in. So it is titled Freedom Village, a memoir, and it is available on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, thrift books. My personal blog website is wearetheoutsiders.com. It's published through payetpublishing.com. The book is available all of those places. If you're local to upstate New York, it is in Long's bookstore in Penn Yan, and they've ordered it 5 times now, which is great. So people are buying it. My mom has also got some copies for sale up at her studio in Dundee on Water Street. And if you can find me in the wild, I've got books with me. So they're in the back of my van. I sometimes when I'm at work, people will, ask me for them. So I've got them on hand. But yeah, it published on November 21st. So we're just a few months in.
Well, congratulations on that great accomplishment. I won't say I'm jealous, but I'm looking forward to the day when I can hold a book in hand that I've written. I think that would be a wonderful accomplishment.
Great.
I'm happy for you that you got to do that. Austin and Kent, do you have any thoughts or questions for Mary before we wind down this conversation?
No, thanks for sharing, Mary. I love how you're just so free to talk about it. If you weren't healed and you weren't, at least most of the way through this whole journey of healing, you wouldn't be able to talk about it like that. And I don't hear any fear or condemnation or anything like that in your voice. You just sincerely want other people to be free.
Yeah.
And so thanks so much for sharing. There's power. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb, the word of the testimony. Thanks for sharing your testimony.
Yeah, I got
Thanks.
a couple more questions. We're not quite done with you yet, Mary. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm really sorry about this, but I had my Zoom recorder on battery and the batteries died, and lesson learned. I'll make sure not to do that again, but is my audio still okay?
We can hear you.
All right.
Yeah.
My apologies again. I'm just talking to the laptop now. Mary, I think it would be good if you could talk a little bit more, bring a little bit more clarity on some of the negative outcomes here, maybe the negative leadership behaviors. If you can speak a little bit to, it sounds like your assessment might be that this leader was spiritually abusive, because I think the three of us, or the four of us, you in particular, know the details, but I think to the listener, they're like, okay, the leader wasn't perfect. I get that. And they had to carry wood around, and that's probably not the best way. And he probably took some liberties, and it sounds like, he raised a lot of money and was maybe a little bit snake oil on some of those things. But, that some of that stuff is actually quite common. But what was happening there was fairly uncommon. It was fairly extreme. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and then also the sort of systemic or longer lasting negative effects that some people, or maybe most people, experience going forward? So the leadership environment you experienced, and then what that sort of created in people's lives going forward.
Yeah. Leadership environment is a really good way to say that. And the way that it has systemically messed people up is huge. I'm now learning that healthy people who happen to have leadership, or they have influence and power given to them over other people, which isn't inherently a bad thing. We just do it as humans. We're just like, you tell us what to do, or we need somebody telling us what we should be doing. But a healthy leader is someone who needs to surround themselves, or will surround themselves, with wise counsel. And that almost always includes adversity and hold me accountable. If someone is to be a good leader, they have to be able to take it when people will come against them, or perhaps even misunderstand them, or maybe even say something nasty about them. And this pastor, the fruit, all I can do is test the fruit. I have every reason to be bitter and say, you're a horrible person and you ruined my life. Didn't, but it's the fruit of his life was paranoia, intensely paranoid man. Everybody was out to get him all the time. You could not say anything negative about him to him or to someone else, or you would be called a gossip. There were just fail safes in every direction to keep him completely above being accountable for anything that he did. And so to me, growing up, systemically, what it did to me and a lot of other people, specifically children that were there, was that was presented as good and right and normal. And what I saw was not only that he had the power to tell people that they had to leave where God believed they called them to go, which was all of the staff came there saying, God brought us here. We've been called by the Lord to come and help these troubled teenagers, and that's what he would hold over them. If you're going to be a gossip, or if you're going to say anything about me or the way I do things, you're out. You're fired. And with that came, and you're out of God's will because of your sin, because you can't stop talking behind people's backs, because you just don't think I know what I'm doing. He had so many ways that he would punish people, but I never saw that. I believed that people who left were Satanists. Once they left, he would then begin a complete smear campaign about them and say they were Satanists. They were, that wife was a lesbian and she, wouldn't submit to her husband. Everything was painted, at least to me, as you defy me, you watch what happens to you. God will take care of you. And he preached about people who had given him the finger and then had a car accident and died 5 minutes later. He was saying these things, but then again, backing them up with scripture. And so it just was so confusing. And I do think a lot of people had a decent brain and went, this is ridiculous, and left. But I was all in, and I just believed that if there's someone who's over you in authority, you don't talk back, you don't ask questions, you don't even let yourself think anything bad about them, because that will eventually lead to coming out of my mouth. And that's the irony of all of this, is that I should be the last person to ever say anything negative about this man or this place, because of the high stakes in my mind growing up was, if I speak against him, I'm speaking against God. If I challenge him, that's me challenging God. And why can't I just have faith? And so that's something that is not just at Freedom Village. Like, that's something that is systemically all throughout churches, where people are afraid. They're afraid to even think that their pastor could be wrong about something. And there are many beautiful, meek pastors. I just find it sad that the people that are often in leadership want to be leaders, and it's like, I wish farmers could be presidents because they don't want to have any power. But it's just like, you rarely find someone that doesn't want power who's in a position of leadership. It corrupts.
Yeah. So if we were to bullet point it, no accountability, no real accountability. If there is accountability there, it's for a show. But behind closed doors, he's still not taking no as an answer, and there's no real accountability. Word is gospel. What this man does, everyone must do. Otherwise, the stakes are high, and there are consequences that you don't want. Yeah. When people leave, they're demonized. Self-serving. I do happen. Well, this was no small secret that very good at raising money, but there was, for a long time, I rented at least 1 or 2 apartments, and they always had a hard time. They usually paid, but it was hard to get the money, and that seemed to be a common theme, including the people that work there. I believe there's quite a number of people to this day that are owed money, from.
Oh, we lived in complete poverty.
Yeah,
working there,
but
while he had a very lavish lifestyle.
Well, that's my point. Yeah, he had a very lavish lifestyle. I remember his son driving one of those Chrysler cars that you don't see around anymore, but they were hot just for a minute back in the day. They had like exposed wheels, and they were long and skinny. They were kind of shaped like a tube, like a race car. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? What kind of car was that?
Yeah.
I don't even know what it was called. It was a little funky, but it was cool for like 15 minutes. And then, anyway, his son got to drive one of those around, and one of those cars driving through Lakemont was kind of a big deal.
Right.
Okay, so continuing down the bullet points.
The Prowler.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. No negative can be said about the person. It's not tolerated. So really, feedback of any kind is not really welcome. But certainly, no negatives can be said. It's not tolerated. Um, Certainly, a very high view of oneself, um, and sort of a synonymity, sort of an indifferentiation between what I say and what God says. Sort of aligning oneself very closely to kind of what I say is what God says. Anything else you would add to that list?
Um, I think I just now I look my dad. So my dad was I say it all the time. I think my father was the only friend this pastor has ever had in his life. My dad loved him, was very, very close. My family was maybe the closest family to Pastor Brothers and his family. Our families were very, very close and connected. And my dad would have supported him till almost the end. But something that he said to me a few years ago is he said, "You know, it's weird, Mary. Now that I look back and I think of all the time that I spent with him as his right-hand man," or my dad said over and over, he was the David, or he was the Jonathan to his David. He said, I can't remember ever hearing him talk about his personal relationship with the Lord. Ever. In private. Almost never even from the pulpit. I mean, there were stories of God inspiring him to start Freedom Village, always with this purpose for he was this, if he was to talk about God, it was, God has told me that I'm going to change the world and save thousands of people. God's never really told me that. It's like there was no intimacy with God in this man's life, apparent from his closest friend, the person who spent all the time with him. And I just find that crazy, that through all of this, there was really no evidence of an actual relationship with God, as I know it to be now. Zero evidence. And yet, how did this man convince so many people to follow him where he was going in the name of God, but with nothing to show for it other than a lot of money and a lot of fame and a successful kingdom that he had built? And, when we were talking before about that Great Commission, and, maybe it's less about joining all these small groups and showing up at church and serving and doing all of these things, if it really was believed to just be, I think I'm just supposed to live my life knowing that Christ is a reality, that is my reality, is utter reconciliation with God that cannot be undone by anything. If that was the reality for all Christians, there probably wouldn't be big mega churches with lots of money. Do you know what I mean? So it's like that a lot of that stuff is so that people can go, oh, this is my church home, and I was so lost, and then I came to this church, and then I joined the group, and I really felt like everybody loved me, and then I got involved, and now I have a sense of purpose, and I'm volunteering 40 hours a week, and you're just like, whoa, 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 whoa. None of that is the gospel. None of that is the gospel. In fact, we're now veering into works-based salvation, where you think you're valuable because you show up and help out. That's not it. And yet that's what Freedom Village was. He built a kingdom for himself. And, again, like we were saying, you have to have friction in life. We only change because of adversity. And Fletcher Brothers built a kingdom for himself where everybody looked how he wanted them to look. Everybody talked how he wanted them to talk. Nobody would say anything against him ever. And if they did, he would make an example out of them so that everyone lived in fear to ever do that. And that was the kingdom that I lived in. And that's not the kingdom of God. That is a a man-made kingdom, and the bad fruit is there. It's just all over the place. People living in fear, paranoia, stabbing each other in the back. And a lot of churches are like this. And then people just, it's sad because then often what's preached from the pulpit is get involved, get more involved, do more, serve more. And, I say that for me, the formula didn't work. It didn't work. I looking at myself on my bedroom floor having a nervous breakdown because of my intense anxiety. What I did not need was to get involved in a church and start serving. Do you know what I mean? And yet that's often what is preached.
Yeah.
And, now we're veering between Freedom Village and modern day churches, but it really is kind of all the same. And why I talk about this is because this isn't so much, hey, let me tell you a good story. It's pretty crazy, and I hope it's a page turner. It's like, this is probably in your life. This is most likely an influence, and just be aware. And it's not to demonize anybody or anything other than what needs demonizing, which is darkness and wickedness, not the people. And I mean, truly, if I have something to say, it is the miracle of being able to now know a God who can separate light and dark, bone and marrow. And it's like, I don't see this pastor, my old pastor, Fletcher Brothers. The thing that really saved me, and it's in the beginning of my book, is that I got even with him. And I want people to get even. And that means like this, like it's like the scripture says that God brings down the proud and lifts up the humble, but that's not just to make another one of these. That wouldn't be God. He wants us to see each other as equals. And for me, that set me free, because I said, oh my gosh, this is just a guy. This is just a man. He's not God. He's not better than me, but I'm not better than him. Like, we're the same. And he is tormented by true wickedness. And it's just, that's what I want, is for the captives to be set free, because that's what happened to me. And I know it was Jesus, because I have mercy for my oppressor. It's like, where else is that coming from? I'm not making that up. I believe that he if he could see, and if I almost feel weird about saying this, but I'll say it anyway. Whatever. I had a pretty distinct, I guess, what people would call a word from the Lord, when I knew that I was going to write this book. And I was afraid. I was afraid of being misunderstood. I was afraid of people thinking that I wanted vengeance. There was a lot of fear, but I also knew that it was time. And I was driving in my car, and I just had an understanding that specifically was, the whole world is going to know what he did. Like, it is going to be, and I knew that my words were going to be involved in that. Everyone is going to know what he did. And your voice will be the only one calling for grace in the middle of it. And that's when I knew I'm doing it. I'm doing this, because you can't have grace without accountability. You just can't. You can't receive grace if you don't think you've done anything wrong, or that you don't deserve it. And so for me, that's how I knew that it was time, and that's how I knew that the book was finished, was because, Austin, thank you so much for saying what you said. There's a restorative bend to this book. It's not a tell-all. It's seeking restoration. And if I have had what happened to me, and I can look at my oppressor and say, it's not you, it's what's behind you influencing you, that I want you free from that. That's kind of where I'm at. And it's a really beautiful place of no fear. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
last question from me: would you consider it a cult?
Yeah, I would. I think I had to come to terms with that. Only because it fits every description in the book. It really, really does. I think a cult is specifically giving a level of authority to someone or people that they should never have, um, and and specifically a spiritual religious cult is accepting lies about God as truth, and it gets so deep into your brain that you can't even begin to think outside of it. And I mean, it was that, and I think my revelation in the midst of this was that it was, and God was there.
Yeah.
So if anything, it proves that God is everywhere, and there's nowhere that God is not. Because if it was hell and God was there, then God is in hell. So it's like,
Yeah.
that's good news. We really can't be separated from His love. So, I know that that's a sort of an inflammatory word, but it was. And there's cults everywhere. They really
Yeah.
are. They're all over the place.
Yeah, yeah, you kind of said what I wanted to touch on there. It does seem like it fits a lot of the characteristics of a cult. The two things I wanted to draw out on that, because there is another group that I have in mind that I don't think any of you know of. It has nothing to do with our upbringings or anything like that. But this group shares a lot of these commonalities, and the leader shares a lot of the commonalities of what we just described. But the other thing that really stands out to me is what you mentioned earlier about there being this struggle back and forth. Some people are like, man, it was so helpful. And other people are like, man, this was so horrible. And then the helpful people are like, yeah, but why are you saying these bad things? Because it really helped me. And then there's other people who are like, this was really, really dark and bad. And these are the issues I'm now dealing with. And there's just this kind of back and forth and, and pull within the group. And that is happening in this other group also. And that seems to be another marker also, where it's like the mind control is so strong that to some, it's like, what's up? It's all good, And then,
Yeah.
but then when you see the light, maybe, or you can step outside of that, then you're ostracized, and then it can really have an adverse long-term effect on people. So those were the two things that I wanted to pull out. I think those are maybe some indications of cult-like behavior.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Ask, and I guess lastly, I've had a lot of people ask me, what do I do if I know somebody that's in that type of an environment, or what do I do if someone that I love is in a spiritually oppressive place? And I worked with tons of Mennonites at Oak Hill, and so many different shades of Mennonite. There's so many different denominations within there, and I just asked questions. And it's like, if somebody that's grown up in that type of an environment are so scared to ask themselves questions, most of the time you have no idea why you're doing what you're doing at all. You have no idea. And it's just, be patient with yourself if it's you, or if it's somebody else, and just ask questions and go slow. It always leads somewhere good.
The other red flag is if you feel like, or even worse, if you're told that you're the enlightened ones. Because from what I understand, you were hearing this. You grew up thinking you're the enlightened one. You're the chosen one. This other group is being taught that exact same thing. They feel like they're the enlightened ones, and that is a red flag.
Definitely. Yeah. I agree.
Very good. That's I love the way that you again brought together the idea that there was some healing that happened in that, and then there was some profound damage, that there was real hell unleashed in people's lives too. But that God's love is sufficient to meet us in all of that. And I think that, when you look at a leader, I had to think, Kent, I don't know what the movement or group that you referenced, what that is, but I thought of, there's been a lot of talk about the kind of aftermath of Mark Driscoll's Mars Hills church. And again, there was, you look at some of the lives of the people whose lives were transformed there, families that were started there, couples that were married there and then had kids, and they have beautiful families today, and would not have, wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Mark Driscoll and his church. But you can't argue with the fact that there was profound abuses that happened in that context as well. And it's just, that's the messiness of humanity. And, the redemptive part of it is that God's love meets us in all of that. And his love redeems everything, can redeem anybody who is willing to humble themselves and surrender to that love and be found, encountered by that love. So I can't think of a better place to stop unless, Austin, you've had another question that came burning into your consciousness while Kent was asking his questions. Good.
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Mary, where would you like for people to connect with you online?
Oh, I'm on Facebook and Instagram as myself. Nothing fancy really going on over here. But yeah, I don't even know my Instagram handle. Wow, I should improve that. I think it's Mary Rosenberger. What's my Instagram?
Are you still blogging?
Yes, I still blog.
Okay.
The website, wearetheoutsiders.com.
Okay, that's a great place.
Find me on there, and yeah. By the way.
All right, and I know people can connect with Austin on Facebook, Wine Trail Properties, with Kent Lapp on X @KentLapp, and you can follow me on Instagram, goodking.life. Good King is the name of my coaching and mentorship group for men, so you can check us out there or at my website, goodking.life. So thank you for being a Metal and Forge listener. Please subscribe and share these episodes with anyone that you think might benefit from them. I want to give a shout out to Kent for the hard work he's doing in providing shorts from these episodes and posting them on YouTube Shorts. We're getting some traction there. There's thousands, if not tens of thousands of views to some of these shorts, and that's awesome. Gets the word out about Metal and Forge. So if you are a listener, we would love to hear from you, either in the comments on YouTube or on our website in our form. You can go to mettleandforge.com. You know how to spell it by now, METTLE, mettleandforge.com. So visit our website, drop a suggestion in the form for a topic or a guest, and we'll be sure to consider that. Thank you, Mary, for the time you've been able to spend with us tonight. It's been a pleasure, and I love seeing what the Lord is doing in you and your family's lives. And please say hello to your awesome husband, Mike, and give him my love. Tell him I miss him. It's been too long since I've seen him. So thank you all for being here. I hope you have a great night. Thanks, guys.
See you all.
Love you all.
Thank you, Mary.
Good night.